Shimshon for Parshas Matos, an explanation that you've never heard before. Medrash Yalkut. He starts off by quoting the Medrash on the verse Al Pasuk Achar Ta'asef Al Amecha, that after the war with Midian, Moshe Rabbeinu is going to be gathered onto his people. This is going to be the final act of Moshe Rabbeinu. After this war, he was going to leave the world. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says the Medrash, that God made the following deal with Moshe. Im ata rotza lichios shanim harbe. If you prefer, you can live many years. Lo yiru Yisrael nekama ba'ovehem, but the Jewish people will not merit to see vengeance against their enemies. V'lo tichavesh Midian lefnehem, and the nation of Midian shall not be conquered by the Jewish people. In other words, Hashem says to Moshe, if you stay in this world, if you choose that you would like to live long, that will be at the cost of the Jewish people avenging themselves from the Midianites.
What's the connection?
We'll have to give him a chance to explain all that. Right now he's just quoting the Medrash. Miyad Amar Moshe, says Moshe, Mutav shetikavesh Midian lifnehem v'yiru Yisrael mapala b'sonhem. Better let the Jewish people conquer the Midianites and let the Jewish people experience the downfall of their enemies. Ad kan l'shono, that's the language of the Midrash. And the Zera Shimshon's first question is, what's the connection? V'yesh l'daktek, I'd like to know, ma inyam Moshe in Milchemes Midian? What does Moshe and his life or death have to do with the war against Midian? So he goes straight into the words of the Kabbalists. Yesh lomar shekasvu amekubalim. He quotes from the Kabbalists. He does not cite them. It's not really clear who. They found some similar source. But here's what the Kabbalists say. Shekol melech osar. Every king or minister. Shebalasus nekama be'ezeh umah. That wants to go to war and take vengeance against a certain nation. Tzarech sheyeh lo eze chibur v'kishur mosa ha'uma, has to have some personal connection to that particular nation. Spiritually speaking, in order for anyone to defeat another nation, if the distance or the divide between them is so great, they cannot be conquered. Kigon, for example, this war against Midian, it had to be led by Pinchas. Shebami b'nos Putiel. We know that Pinchas was a grandson of Yisro. He was also I guess you would say, 1/4 Midianite, or maybe even half if his mother counts as a Midianite. Because just like Moshe married one of the daughters of Yisro, our sages understood that Elazar, the mother of Pinchas, also Elazar's wife, the mother of Pinchas, also married one of the daughters of Yisro. So Asa Nekama b'Midian, you need Pinchas to go to war against Midian, because some stranger would have no connection enough to overcome them, I guess, on a spiritual level, which would then allow the Jews to win the war on a physical plane.
Well, he's just replacing one stira with another stira.
We have to see how he resolves the question. We have to give him a chance. Right now he's just quoting the Kabbalist. He's not answering the question yet.
All right.
David, Sheba me Rusa Moavia. David, who is a descendant of Rus, Asa Nakama b'Moav. If you look in the Torah and the Navi, it describes David defeating the Moabites. Why? Because he was a descendant of Moab and he has some connection to Moab, and therefore he could overcome them. V'Yoshua, Shoyi Mizera Yosef, Sheniz Gadol bebeis Potifar. Yoshua was of the tribe of Yosef. Yosef was raised in the house of Potifar. So that's why he was able to be married to someone from the other side. Shalakach Rachav Azona. Yeshua was able to marry Rachav, the Zona, the one who saved the spies. And the Gemara tells us that Yeshua ended up marrying her. So for him to be able to do that, he had to have this being the descendant of Yosef, who had this connection to that level of immorality and overcoming it, allowing Yeshua to then be married to her. Vihi Yoda'azos, and she knowing this, meaning Yeshua, because he was on that level, Asa Milchama ba'Amalek, That's why Moshe sends Yehoshua to go to war against Amalek. So he says, the Amalek uBilam, these two words, Amalek and Bilam, gematria are the same numerical value as B'Mitzrayim. They're the same numerical value. Ki B'Mitzrayim, Ba'Bilam B'Koach Amalek, Litein Eitza Leparo. Again, we haven't explained any of this, we're just reading what the Kabbalists say, that Amalek can take on different forms, even though on a physical plane, Amalek is the son of Eliphaz, the son of Esav, but Amalek is really anyone who harbors such deep hatred for the Jewish people that it goes beyond any kind of logic. And that's why we say that the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, they were the Amalekites. Even if you could trace back any of these people and find that they're not descendant of Amalek, that would still make them Amalekites because they had a hatred that went beyond anything logical or anything that would make sense in the physical world. In the same way, Bilam, he has such hatred for the Jewish people in Mitzrayim. As the Gemara tells us, Shlosha hayu ba'osa eitza, there were three who were in that council. Bilam was the one who was pushing and driving Paro to destroy the Jewish people and to throw the babies in the water, and all these other extreme decrees. So Amalek and Bilam appear together in Mitzrayim. V'kan vayavo Amalek, and we're told that when the Jewish people leave Mitzrayim, Amalek shows up. Me'echem ba, from where did he come? Amruzal, Shaba me'etzel Bilam Arash, and the Medrash tells us that Amalek had been convening with Bilam and went to go to war against the Jewish people. Amalek, who rosh l'klipos. Amalek, he is the head, the worst, the leader of the other side, the klipos literally being husks. He is the head of all the husks, of all the shells of the forces of evil. Because after the Jewish people conquer Sichon and Og, and the Jewish people were supposed to go into the land, Yisrael Ksiv, Reishis Goyim Amalek, that's where Bilam invokes, and he says, Reishis Goyim Amalek, that's a verse in Parshas Balak, because that's the Bilam Amalek connection, which is going to be fought by this war with Pinchas. Ad Kan Lashona, that's what the Kabbalists say. Okay, now he's not explaining all the points that the Kabbalists are going to have discussed here. But the main point here is that in order for a person, a Jew, to be able to overcome a certain peoples who are our enemies, there has to be some deeper connection there, and maybe even some source. Now, we've discussed this a little bit before with the Parshas Vayishlach. The Haftorah for Parshas Vayishlach is the book of Ovadia. It's the one of the only two times that we read an entire book as a Haftorah. Let's see if anyone can think of the other one. Yonah and Yom Kippur, right? But Ovadia, even though technically it's only 1/12 of a book because it's Trei Asar, but we read the book of Ovadia. Why? Because Ovadia was a ger. He was a convert. He was the only ger who was himself a navi. And his prophecy is all about the downfall of Esav. And in Parshas Vayishlach, we describe the Esav and his family and all the things which they did. So the appropriate haftorah for that is the book of Ovadia, which describes the downfall of Esav, which is foretold by Ovadia, who was a ger, a descendant of Esav. So it has to come from there. It has to come from Esav's own descent comes the force or the foretelling of the destruction of Esav. Now he's going to explain why that is, but that's an idea we've seen before, that he's trying to use that to explain why it is that it has to be Pinchas who has to lead the war against Midian.
Did he have it in the war before he became Jewish, or he had it prior to that?
No, Ovadia only becomes a Navi once he's a Jew.
Okay.
But I'd like to know what's the reason. Ma'u atam shetzarich shezeh hamelech osar yeh lo chiber mosa uma she'osa nekama. What is the reason why you need that the king or the leader should be someone who has a connection to that nation in order to take vengeance? Why can't any Jew lead the vengeance against our enemies? So he goes to a place I don't think anyone would have dreamed to go to. The halachas of Sefer Torah. The Isa b'Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, there's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Tashmishei Kedusha, that objects that are serving something which is Kodesh, Kigon Tikshel Tefillin, your Tefillin bag, Umezuzas, or the case for the mezuzah, Usvarim, or the case, the bookshelves that hold Svarim, Yesh lahem kedusha. They also have holiness, but tzarach lagonzam, and they need to go to Geniza. They need to go to Shemus. Many people don't realize that
Bookcases?
well, bookcases is a debate. We'll see, but seemingly, yeah, on a simple level, the bookcases need to go to Shemus. There's some debate about that whether it applies, but certainly any box or thing, people don't realize that if you buy a set of Sfarim, if you buy it with those sleeves. So there are many opinions who hold that if as soon as you get home you throw out the sleeves, you could throw it straight in the garbage. But if you put the books on the shelf in the sleeve, as if they are still meant to be there to protect the books and to keep them together, then you've decided and you've declared it to be a tashmish of Kedusha, and those sleeves that hold the books need to go into Shemus. Because they are tashmishe Kedusha. Tashmishe Kedusha means they are objects meant to serve something holy.
So why is it that tzitzis don't need to be...
So tzitzis are tashmishe mitzvah, which is different than tashmishe kedusha. Because tzitzis themselves don't have kedusha. For example, you can take tzitzis into the bathroom and things like that. So they're considered an object of a mitzvah. So while the mitzvah itself should be treated with dignity and not just thrown in the garbage, but tashmishe mitzvah, things that are used for the mitzvah, have no holiness in them at all. So, for example, if tzitzis are worn out, you could remove the tzitzis from the beged and throw the beged itself into the garbage, while the tzitzis should be wrapped nicely and not thrown directly into the garbage, but should be placed into a plastic bag and shown some dignity. But it still doesn't have the status of tashmishe kedusha, which are things which have intrinsic kedusha, such as sfarim or mezuzahs and tefillin and things like that.
Svarim, you mean svarim that have Hashem's name in it. Like other svarim do not.
Well, anything that would qualify as shemos. Right. So that's the halacha, that tashmishe kedusha also have kedusha, and they have to be buried. In fact, there was a great rabbi who insisted that they should make his casket out of the wood of his bookshelves. But I would recommend that only for someone who's actually used those books. Otherwise, they won't speak well for the person. But Ocham, furthermore, there's another halacha. The Aron Habanui B'choma, that if there's a Aron Hakodesh, meaning a bureau or a bookshelf that's built into the wall, Imasfarim is kalkalimbo, if it's actually not good, meaning it's ruining the books or ruining the Sfarim, if it's not built in a way, it's built into the wall and it allows mold or mildew to get into the Sfarim, the halacha is Eimbo Kedusha, it has no holiness. If it's not supporting or protecting the Sfarim, it has no holiness. Upirish Magen Avram, the Magen Avram explains, the lochala alav kedusha miikara, that it never gets the status of holiness. The lo mikri tashmish today, because it's not called something which is protecting or helping the books or the Sfarim. Elamazik today, it's actually destroying, or it is to the detriment of the Sfarim. It is a negative force for the Sfarim, and therefore it has no kedusha. Ad kan l'shono. That's the halacha in Hilchos Sefer Torah. The sages of truth, that's another term for the Kabbalists, they tell us, Shekala neshamas hakadoshus, all the great souls, every one of the holy souls, mitchila haya biyad aklipos, is originally surrounded or contained or I wouldn't use the word kidnapped, but taken by the husks by the other side. It's true of every great soul that you can mention. He gives some examples. Kigon Avraham, Miterach. Avraham, his soul was born to Terach as if the other side was trying to steal Avraham and keep him from becoming who he was supposed to become. So they found not just some random guy of that generation, but the czar of idol making of that time. V'chein David haya b'Moav. David's soul was hidden in the realm of Moav. That's from his grandmother Rus, and she herself would take you back to the story of Lot and his daughters. At the Chsiv, as it says in Tehillim, written by David, Matzasi David Avdi, I found my servant David, and the Medrash tells us, Heichan Matzasiv b'Sodom. In Sodom, according to one explanation, that's why Lot is saved, because of David who is to come from him. V'chein Pinchas, Bami benos Putiel, Pinchas is a grandson of Yisro. V'chein Yeshua, Bami Yosef, Shalakach Asnas Bas Potifera, and Yeshua comes from Yosef, who marries the daughter of Potiphar and his wife, which, even if you learn that she might not have been their original daughter, but a descendant of the house of Yaakov, even if you take that medrash, nevertheless, that was stolen and taken to the darkest of places and raised by the most evil woman that Yosef encounters. And furthermore, Yeshua is going to end up marrying Rachav, L'tashlum Chatzi Gufo, to complete his other half. The dacha b'lo nukva pala gufa, because a man without the woman is only half a person. So the completion of his soul, imagine that, the completion of the soul of Yehoshua is Rachav Hazona.
But she's special because she contributes to the saving of the Jewish people.
That's right, but where does she come from? That's what he's focused on. Is that she was really a very special holy person. Yeshua wasn't just going to marry her in gratitude, but he saw that despite the circumstances and the life that she faced, she was in fact a very holy person, which just goes to prove that the greatest of the souls are hidden sometimes in the darkest of places. The Im Kain, if so, says the Zerah Shimshon, Hayisal Gedaitach, I might have thought, we know that before we remove all the holy sparks, before we take the kedusha from a certain nation, we're not allowed to go to war against that nation. If there is some plan that God has for this nation in the future to bring out some great soul, so Hashem tells us, don't go to war with them, go around. Moshe. That's why in the Torah it says Moshe was commanded, Shelo lasos mulchamim Ammon and Moav. You can't go to war against Ammon and Moav. And the Gemara tells us, Bishvil shtei paredos tovas she'asad lo tzim mehem, that Rus is going to come from Moav, and we're assuming that if the Jews go to war with Moav, there would be no Moav left, and David would never have been born. And if the Jews go to war with Ammon, there would be no Naamah, the wife of Shlomo HaMelech, the mother of Rechavam, and the whole line of the house of David would come from her, and eventually Mashiach ben David would issue from that line. And so Hashem says you can't go to war against them until we can extract that holiness, those souls.
Is that why the Klal Yisrael in the Midbar have to go around Mount Seir?
Right.
And not engage Esau?
Right.
And not engage
Right.
Edom?
Exactly. So he says, Kach la'achar atzaras ha'preidos tovos. But then, even after you take these preidos tovos, which literally means the birds, but it's a metaphor for the two women, Rus and Nama. Yesh lanu lomer. Then I might have argued, she'asur lasas imam melchama. You can go to war against them. So he says, but then these nations should be like the bookshelf, like the book sleeves for that holiness, that they contained, that they were the vessels to have this great holy soul. V'yesh lahem adin shal tashmishay kedusha, in which case they should have the status of the objects that were used to protect and hold something holy, shitu'unin geniza, that need to be treated and disposed of with dignity. They need to be hidden in the ground and not destroyed and just wiped out wantonly. But that depends. It depends on what kind of bookcase it was. But you could argue, if this was the bookshelf that was bringing harm to the books, if this was a bag that was moldy or caught bringing mildew to the tefillin or to the mezuzah, then lo nikru mi'olim tashmisha kedusha, then they weren't referred to as objects that are supporting or helping the kedusha, elamazik le kedusha. So the question is, the peoples that are holding and containing, who are the custodians of these souls, are they for its benefit or to its detriment? And furthermore, they were fighting to keep this soul from coming into the world. So who can tell us? Who can inform us as to whether or not these souls were helped or withheld by harmed by being in shaklipe zikos or nitzos, that those husks might have caused harm to that spark? Dilma shamer osikaroy, maybe they were protecting it. Lechein, that's why. Tzarich shedavka oso hanitzos yinka min ha'umahi. That's why it has to be that only that spark, that person who issues from that people, he can do it. Because the kedusha in him, that spark in him, somehow he feels, in other words, if he has a good feeling towards that nation, that means that within him, his soul is telling him that he benefited from being a descendant of those people. But if he feels a hatred or animosity towards that person, that means that his soul is telling him that these people were actually holding him back. So he says that spark can tell that whether they were causing damage, or withholding him from doing the mitzvah. Now, interestingly for this, so this is the Zera Shimshon is a Mekubal, but sometimes you have people who are familiar with the realm of Kabbalah, but they're not so familiar with the other realms of Pshat and Halacha and things like that. And so it limits them, and sometimes they'll end up saying things in the realm of Kabbalah that go against the Pshat in the realm of Halacha. That's why it's so incredible when you have someone like the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai was considered the greatest in his generation in Kabbalah, while at the same time being the greatest in his generation in Halacha. And in Agada and things like, what the Ben Ish Chai was to his generation is hard to imagine. But that's the reason why he's spoken of with such esteem, is because he wasn't just on one track. He was of the greatest in almost every track in Torah. So he said, now here the Zera Shimshon is going to swing us back into the realm of Halacha, and he quotes the Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat, Shamazik mamon chavera, if someone damages someone else, ve'ein yodua ma hizik, but he doesn't know what damage he caused, hanizuk nishba v'notel, so the victim, he can swear as to what the damage was, v'notel, and he can collect. Ketzad, haresh lakach klisasu mechavero, if I took a box, I took a jewelry box that belongs to you, and I threw it into the sea. I don't know how much damage I caused you. So the halacha is, you burn it in fire. So if the victim claims that they had a pearl necklace in there that was worth $10,000, you owe $10,000. Anything in that is believed. Now obviously there's a shavua involved. You have to make an oath, otherwise we're afraid people will just say whatever they want. So we have to bring some level of accountability and make that person take an oath.
It's not just an oath, you have to each swear an oath in Hashem's name, right?
Yeah, well, that's whatever the din shavua is, right, in this case. But that person is believed because people know themselves and they're believed as to what kind of damage or harm was caused them. So he's saying, using that halacha, we, the Jewish people, we don't know what damage was caused, but the soul, the spark that came out of that place, knows and feels the experience that he went through. He says, "Avalam oso hanitzus lo yasa malchama va'oso ha'uma." But if that spark, that soul which escaped from there, doesn't feel that want or need to go to war, in case siman, that's a sign shelo kibel shum nezek mi'aklipa, that he was not harmed by being in that place. V'hador shall also anitzlik, that the entire generation of that spark, or that tzaddik, einu yachalin kol mi'osu uma, are prohibited from taking vengeance against those people. V'pnei she'adarab, on the contrary, asa tov l'dor hazeh, because those people, we have to actually show gratitude to that. That generation is to show gratitude. That they kept this soul safe to provide it for our generation. Then you could say that the husk did not cause damage to the holiness. And we have to look at those people as the bookcase that held this holy book.
It's interesting that by Mitzrayim, we also say that there should be a little bit of Hakora Satov, that they, even though they were so horrible to
Right.
us, but nevertheless, they kept us. And
Right, but there the question is, we did have a benefit,
Right.
but they weren't intending for that benefit. That's where you run into a
Hashem
funny
had
place.
to take us out himself to do that, and it wasn't like a Pinchas, right?
Well, but it kind of was, because you see, Moshe is also raised in the house of Paro. So
but I'm saying this would fit. This
Right.
would be another reason behind the scenes of
Right.
why Mitzrayim maybe was guarded.
we do punish them. Hashem punishes them, which is kind of what you're saying. But we have that sense of that mixed feeling of gratitude. He says, and the proof for this is, he's repeating his point, but he's making it clear that the spark has to demand vengeance. And if that spark doesn't demand vengeance, that means that the rest of us shouldn't feel that way. So the Jewish people need to go take vengeance against Midian. They caused the Jewish people to sin. But Moshe was raised by the Midianites. And he married a woman from there. That's why Hashem has to command Moshe to do it. That the fact that they were holding on to this great soul, we would assume that that's referring to both Moshe and Moshe's wife Zipporah. If Moshe would not have been around had Moshe died first, the Jewish people couldn't take vengeance, even if Pinchas may have felt it. But if Moshe doesn't feel that need for vengeance, that entire generation, if Moshe would have left the world without taking vengeance from Miriam, they would have had to be concerned that Moshe saw Midianites as the people who did and work for the positive. That's why Hashem says to them, you need to tell the Jewish people that whatever souls they were holding on to was because they were trying to keep them from you and they were trying to cause harm. And even though Moshe escaped from it, and Moshe's wife Tzipporah, maybe Yisro himself escaped from that, but that wasn't because of the Midianites wanting to protect. Then you can die. Once you've died, the Jewish people would not be able to take vengeance. So he's understanding it's not that Hashem is saying to Moshe, after you do this, then you're going to die. He's learning is the other way. Moshe Rabbeinu needs to die. But if Moshe Rabbeinu dies, the Jewish people will have to be concerned that maybe Moshe did have a positive perspective towards Midian, which would force them to have a positive perspective towards Miriam, and they would no longer be allowed to go to war, even if Pinchas would have felt something negative. So Hashem says to him, it's you and Pinchas, I want you to send the Jewish people to war. Pinchas actually leads the war, and the fact that both of them felt like they had escaped from there after an attempted harm on the part of the Midianites, that allows the Jews to go to war against Midian.
I have two questions. First is, what happened to Hakarat HaTov? I mean, we say Moshe didn't, hit the water to turn to blood, and he didn't do it for Tzfardea because he had Hakarat HaTov for the water that saved him. What about Hakarat HaTov for having his wife there, for keeping him safe until he needed to come to
Well, this is the way I understand it. We have a whole Pesach night where we celebrate. We do the destruction of the Egyptians. The question is, it says in the Torah that we're supposed to appreciate the Egyptians, and the lo sasayev mitzri, don't despise them because you were strangers in their land and they hosted you. So the way I understand that is that when we talk about appreciating people who hosted you, even if they caused you harm, let's create an example. Let's say a person is stuck. What?
Yeah, what happened when Yaakov was with him?
By Lavan. Yeah. So this is the way you have to understand. Let's say you stay at someone's house. This is a strange example, but work with me here. Let's say you have to stay somewhere overnight, and you don't have a place to stay, and so someone makes arrangements for you to stay at a house. And so what happens is, this is strange, but just work with me here, the person invites you into their house, takes you down to the basement, and says, this is your room, sends you into the room, and locks you in. You turn on the light, and there is nothing on the floor except a pitcher of water and a pile of straw. Now, no one has slept on a pile of straw in 100 years, but yet somehow you are being told that you should sleep here overnight on this pile of straw, and then in the morning, after you take your achy bones, after sleeping overnight basically on the hard floor, they open the door and they say, now get out of my house. Appreciate or not appreciate?
If it's stormy outside, you appreciate it.
So you have to appreciate the amount of appreciation that's expected for that amount of hosting that this person did. But that doesn't mean that you should marry your children to their children. So, and when we talk about gratitude, it means you still have to think about and appreciate this person for what they've done. But if they've caused you harm and led you on to believe that you were going to have something and instead you had something else. So when we talk about the Egyptians, the Torah tells us that a third generation Egyptian we are required to allow in. While an Ammonite and a Moabite, we don't allow them in at all. The women are fine. But the men we don't allow in ever. And Amalek, we don't accept Gerim from them. But with the Egyptians, we appreciate them enough that their first generation was still going to reject. And the second generation, the third generation, once they've gone a certain distance, we can now say, up to this point, you're far enough from being an Egyptian. We're talking about the third generation Jew. That means that the first generation converted and they can't marry a regular Jew, then the second generation, and then the third generation Jew, which is someone who was born and their grandparents were Jewish. We have enough gratitude to the Egyptians to allow that. And it's a mistake that many people make when they say that you're supposed to have gratitude to someone who hosted you even if they did something bad for you. And that's not true. You have to have a certain amount of gratitude. You have to balance that gratitude, because even if someone did something bad to you, if they also did something good for you, you have to continue to appreciate that good to a certain extent.
If the first generation Mitzri wasn't allowed to marry a Jew, and the second generation Mitzri wasn't allowed to marry a Jew, how can there be a third generation that was a Jew?
They would have to marry a fellow Egyptian convert, would be the simplest way to do it. And then, of course, you have a long discussion in the Gemara as to who else they can marry. Can they marry Mamzerim? That would make their family Mamzerim. Can they marry other Gerim from other nations? This is a long discussion, but there's no shortage of whom they can marry. They just can't marry Kohen Levi Yisrael, that's for sure.
Is there a difference between gratitude and nekama? You're talking about going to war. So, do we find examples in the Torah where you're not allowed to go to war against a previous generation that did wrong to you?
What do you
Are
mean?
there any can a nation go to war against another nation for something that was done in previous generations?
Well, if you're supposed to, if you can't despise them, then you certainly wouldn't be able to. If we're supposed to show gratitude to the Egyptians, we certainly shouldn't go to war with the Egyptians just for the sake of going to war. Meaning, if they attack us, we can defend ourselves, but you wouldn't be allowed to punish them for what they've done if the feeling that we're supposed to have towards them is gratitude. But what we're saying is that that gratitude also has its definitions, and many people make the mistake of saying, or trying to compare. I've heard this argument many times. Well, yeah, this person harmed you. Parents who brought harm to their children, and people say, well, you have to show them gratitude and love because of. So now, many people feel like their parents, caused them. But we're talking about in a situation where there was actual, abuse and that kind of thing. So many people say, well, even the Egyptians, we have to show gratitude. No, you do have to show gratitude to the extent of what they might have done. But that doesn't mean that you erase the negatives and show the same kind of gratitude that someone else would have towards a parent that was a somewhat decent parent. And it could be even with parents. The level of gratitude should depend on how much they gave of themselves and how much they. But to say that just because they hosted you like the Egyptians, so therefore you have to have an equal amount, that's not necessarily true. All right, we'll leave the rest of this. Mitzvah Hashem, we'll leave it here and continue next.